God, I just pray that as we look at it, as we put our eyes upon it, Lord, that you would just give us new revelations, that you would give us new insights, that you would just let us see things that we've never seen before. God, we just love you, and we love the way that the Word was written, and we just thank you that there's so much reliability in the Word, just knowing the Word of Luke writing the book of Acts, and just being inspired by you, God, that we're able to learn so much. And God, I just pray that this is not just a Bible study to make our brains larger or to make us know more, but God, to bring us closer to you in everything that we read and everything that we study. And God, that's the real point of opening the Word, is to know the God who wrote it. So we just love you so much. We thank you for all that Jesus has done for us, and we pray in His name. Amen. So I'm going to go ahead and read for us the entire chapter 27 again, since we have such new people this morning. But last week we actually looked at the first 26 verses. Today we're going to end the chapter with verses 27 through 44. But like I said, I'm going to go ahead and read all of it again so that we have kind of a picture of what's happening here. Paul has entered a boat. He's sailing for Rome, but they get into a little bit of trouble. So let's read it. My Bible is the ESV, the English Standard Version. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to the centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking in a ship Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea, along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon as tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground at Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of being saved, or of our being saved, was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we must run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were, in all, 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors, and they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef or a sandbar, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest were on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. What a fantastic story we're reading today. I'm going to take a couple minutes just to stand up and tell you about the map that's behind me. It tells kind of the direction of the story. First, we find earlier in the book, a chapter or two, Paul is in Jerusalem and Judea during a celebration where he's kind of giving his defense and his trip to the religious leaders that are there. He's going to the church, he's giving alms, and he's going to different places, kind of making his case. He has to travel from Judea to different places like Caesarea, which is up here, to kind of prove his innocence in a way. And then they end up finding him pretty much innocent at this point. They said this man could have been set free a long time ago. So he leaves on the first ship in a town called Sidon, which we read about. It says he boards this ship sent to Rome to appeal to Caesar, but they didn't make it. So they travel up north around Cyprus, and they switch ships in a town called Myra to a grain trading ship. And it's supposed to make it all the way over to Italy over there, and it ends up having a really bad time. So they travel here to Cnidus, where they travel down to Crete. So they kind of stop here in Crete, where there's a warning of dangers. It says that they've passed the time of the fast, which is in the Jewish tradition, the Yom Kippur, which is where they celebrate kind of their time of the year, and they take a fast, and that's why they haven't eaten for 14 days. So they stop here, and Paul is warning them because after the time of Yom Kippur is usually a time where the sailing becomes more difficult. It's not a good time of year to be on the ocean. So he says, I suspect we're going to take injury and loss, not just the food, not just what we have on board, but also our lives. But they set sail thinking that they'll have a better, they want to travel away from Fair Havens because it's not a good place to stay in the winter. So what the Bible explains is they're just trying to sail a few miles this way to Phoenix, but they end up not making it. They think because there's a nice wind coming from the south that they're going the right way and they're going to make it, but there's a northeaster wind that's really bad that ends up blowing them out to sea, and so they never make it to Phoenix. This is where they're caught for their 14 days after staying at Fair Havens, and they're not eating, they're not able to do anything like that. They're tossing and turning, they're caught in a storm, and then all of a sudden they get to a point where they've totally lost hope, which we read about last week. And finally, after Paul is able to kind of bring them back together and give them an encouraging word, we see them now as continuing their voyage. They have to run it aground. The ship is being torn apart. And at the very end, we see that they were swimming to shore. They were riding on pieces of the boat to shore. And finally, they make it to some land. But even when they get there, they don't know where they are. They don't recognize the land, and they're having to now find their way on an unknown island. All right, so this kind of explains what they've been through up to this point. We enter in verse 27, and they're in this part, caught in the sea, in the storm. And then Paul, at the end of the chapter, is saying, stay on the boat. If you get off the boat, you're going to die. If you stay on the boat, your life will be saved. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today, which I think is incredible. So, in verses 1 through 26, we see the beginning of the story. They're making it all the way past certain places, Lakewood, Fair Havens, which I thought was ironic. With a name like that, you think it'd be an awesome place, but it's actually not a good place to winter or store your boat in the wintertime. That's why they're trying to move it, and they find themselves in a storm out in the middle of the sea. So starting in verse 27, we see that they're being caught at sea is on their 14th day. It says that in verse 27, on the 14th day, they were driven across the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight, they thought they were near land. So I think this is kind of a fun process to look at here. It says that they took a sounding and found how deep the water was underneath the boat. Well, I did a little bit of research because I didn't know how they took a sounding without any sonar equipment or anything like that. It turns out they dropped metal, like leaded thread or leaded line, to the bottom of the ocean. And when it hit and they felt vibrations through the thread, they knew that it had hit the ground, and then they just pull it back up and they measure the line that they had dropped. So it's a weighted line, and they drop it down, and as soon as it hits, they mark it, and then they pull it up and they measure the line that they had dropped. So it's probably not a perfect way of measuring, but to them, it showed them if they were able to drop the anchors or not, and if they were going to hit land or not. So they dropped the line, they found their soundings. The first one was about 20 fathoms, which is 120 feet. And then they kept going a little bit farther, and they found that it was 15. So this told them that they were getting shallower. They were getting closer to land. So they were getting to a place where they might be able to stop their boat. They might be able to be safe, either run it aground and stay there until they can finally see the sun and the stars. I don't know if you caught that in the first point. We talked about it last week. But they were in the middle of a storm where not even the sun or the stars could be seen. So they were completely without direction, without a single way of knowing which way they could go. They undergirded the ship. They took the sails down, and they were truly just at the will of the waves in the ocean, which is a scary place to be. Like we enter into this point, we talked about it a little bit last week, but they were completely fearing for their lives. They were without hope. They were ready to jettison everything that was on the boat, which means just throw everything that's unnecessary overboard. And part of those things included, I know it talks about the tackle. Some of those things are like the rope for the ship, like extra rope, things that they would have needed, So they're really just giving up any hope of life. And then we see, where is it? I think it's coming up in verse 28 or 29. Fearing that they might run on rocks, they let down their 4 anchors from the stern, and they prayed for day to come. And then verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow. So they were trying to escape the boat. They said, okay, we can drop. The ship's boat is it's like the dinghy, it's like the safety boat. So they drop the ship's boat in the water, and they're thinking about taking it because they can anchor the boat, they can get off, and they can be safe in a different boat. But this is kind of where we see the human condition of helplessness and just what we're trying to figure out in our own minds. How am I going to survive this? What am I going to do? And this is the part in the Bible study where I make it apply to ourselves here. I feel like when we sometimes get in troubled positions or situations, one of our immediate reactions is, how can I fix this? What can I do in my power to try to escape? What can I do in this hard situation, in this difficulty, to make it my problem that I can fix, to make it not as bad as it seems to be? And they knew how bad this was. They knew how bad the storm had been. They hadn't eaten for 14 days. They couldn't see where they were going. They were just grasping at straws here, trying to find a little bit of hope. And I feel like at the end of the day, what we have to ask ourselves is, where do we go when we're losing hope? Where do we go when we feel like there's not a solution in sight? Because I know them dropping the boat and hoping to just go somewhere else, this was a last-ditch effort. They didn't have any other options. They were thinking about throwing the food off the boat. They had already gotten rid of everything else. So in those moments where we're struggling, in those moments where there's difficulty in life, do we try and fix it ourselves and forget about God? Or do we go to Him first and let Him come up with a solution for us? And I think that's a big question here, because it seems like the only person on the boat that was thinking anything about God was Paul. And that's kind of my segue into the next part, because we talk about what Paul says next, what his advice is, his one and only godly advice, I think, in this certain situation. So after they took their soundings, after they found that they were getting closer to land, they dropped the anchors just in case they could stick their boat somewhere and wait for the sun to come out. And then in addition to that, they dropped the boat just in case they needed to get on it and make their way out. Paul then says in verse 31, he said to the centurion, he was the soldier that was over Paul's voyage. This was the soldier that Paul was in custody of. So he was in charge of Paul and pretty much the rest of the prisoners on the boat. So he says to the centurion here and the rest of the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So Paul says, very bold statement here, if you get off this ship, you're not going to make it. So what do they do after hearing him? They actually listen this time. They get rid of their escape plan, and they decide to stay on the boat with Paul. And I know we read it earlier, but I want to go back to the words of Paul, his encouraging words when they're without hope just a little bit ago. If I can find it here. Urge you to take heart. Okay, so it's in verse 21. I'm going to read these words of Paul. It says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, You should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. You see, Paul knew that God's mission and plan for him was to make it to Rome and to speak before Caesar. This was a promise we heard back in Acts 20, it's either 21 or 23, I believe. That was over a month ago now. In chapter 23, I'm going to go ahead and make a decision here. Hopefully it's right. In Acts 23, Paul was told by God that he was going to make it to Rome to proclaim in front of Caesar and all the people in Rome that God sent Jesus, that Jesus is the Messiah, and to continue this gospel sharing in a new place. So God, knowing Paul was going to make it, is telling him now, do not be afraid. Keep these people on the boat. You guys are going to be okay. So when we look at Paul, he's steady. He is being a structure like a strong tower and a pillar in the storm because he knows what God says and he knows that he can trust God. So God, in this case, is saying, keep these men in the boat and all of you will be saved. You see, God, and the Bible says other places, he doesn't want any man to perish, but he wants all of them to come to saving grace in Jesus Christ. It's not God's plan that people would die, in certain situations where they have no hope. But I feel like through Paul's witness and this message of God to all of the men on the boat, men were not just able to be physically saved, but also they could hear about God, the truth of Jesus, and how to truly be spiritually saved, and that they would come to faith. And I think after the ship comes to land, or there are men and prisoners that make it to shore, I have no doubt that God uses this in a mighty way to add more numbers to the kingdom of God. And that's the good part about this testimony, is not that Paul said, trust in God, and then they all perished in the shipwreck and they all passed away. But no, Paul says, trust in God. He told me that you would be safe. And then at the end of the day, they all made it. So God is truthful, God is trustworthy, and his word through Paul is used in a mighty way. So we see in verse 31 and 32, after Paul says, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved, then they cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and they let it go. So they made the decision, and I love this, it shows that they were willing. They cut the ship loose. The one means of, if this ship was run aground and they found themselves still in the middle of the sea, this one ship that they had let down was the only way for them to make it anywhere else. It was the only way for them to paddle through shallow waters because their bigger ship was not going to make it. And they decide to cut it loose. Their last way of making it in their minds was gone. This shows true surrender. This shows that they made the decision that my worldly means of escaping are not good enough. I'm going to listen, take Paul for his word, take God for his word, and I'm going to trust that he's got the better way. So I think in this instance, this was a big move of faith. This is God looking at them and saying, okay, they made the right decision. They're believing, they're having faith in what Paul is saying. And I think all of us have that moment in life where we finally decide that God and what he says is better than what any other person says, and it's better what I say, it's better than what we think, and I think they're finally getting there. All right, and we see that in verse 32. Verse 33 continues now and says, as the day was about to dawn, which means the next day was coming, the morning was there, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head, of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. So I think I see a similarity here. I have it written down in my notes that it was kind of like when Noah built his ship and had the flood and everything happened. This was a sign, and Paul was saying to them, after 14 days, I finally see the light. I finally see the end of the tunnel. Kind of like how Noah on the ark, he set the dove free with the branch, or he set the dove free, and then one returned with the branch and showed that there was life coming through the waters, and then eventually the bird that he set free never came back, which showed that the flood waters were receding and they could finally find land at some point. And I think that's what Paul is trying to do here, saying it's the 14th day, the dawn is emerging, the new day is coming. This is a time for us to celebrate, to gain strength. It's been 14 days, the ship's not going to make it. It's time for us to eat and to look forward to what's happening here. And I love the process. So we have to talk about how Paul does this. And I just want to say this right now. Everybody on this ship is not a Christian. Everybody on this ship does not believe in God. I'm not 100% certain, but other than Paul's friends that he's traveling with, I don't think anybody else on this ship is a Christian, or at least a Jesus-believing Christian. So when we look at what he does, he takes these things, he takes the bread, and he gives thanks to God in the presence of all. And then it says he broke it and they began to eat. This is a very good thing that Paul is doing, because he's giving thanks to God in the presence of all, whether they believe in God or not. He knows that giving thanks to God is what God deserves. So it's not about what other people will think. It's not about what other people's religious practices are. Paul says we are going to be saved by God, and God needs the thanks for our rescuing, for our saving. And all of this is a witness. This is the big application point for me. It's like, I know I live a private and personal relationship with Jesus. I don't get my relationship from anywhere else. I make the decision to follow him and to live a life with him. But that to be said, God is the one that uses my life and my testimony to reach other people. Paul is doing this because he knows it's right for him, but he does it in the presence of all. He doesn't let anybody else's opinion, he doesn't let anybody else's religious beliefs keep him from thanking the God that is worthy to be praised, but also deserving of the thanks, because he's the one that is rescuing them. And Paul knows this. And the big thing for me is, if I don't live my life knowing that I should give thanks to God, the circumstances shouldn't declare for me. They shouldn't change any way that I thank God or that I live my life. So I think Paul is being faithful. He's being a faithful servant of God, but also he's being, oh my goodness, a great witness for what God has been doing. And that's what your life can be. That's what your life should be. It's about living faith in public. You see, no situation, no group of people, no time and no place should change the way that you view God and the way that you worship him. And to be honest, they've been shipwrecked for 14 days. They had no hope. If God says you're going to be safe and you're going to make it, yes, there should be thanksgiving. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember as Christians as well, is that there's always something to give thanks for. Even in the times where it seems like nothing is going right, you're having the worst day ever, or maybe the worst time, there's always something to give thanks for. And when you stop giving thanks, it means that God stops getting the glory. So when we stop being thankful for the good things that we have and the good things that he's given, you stop giving thanks to God, even though he still does deserve it. So learning from Paul in this case, taking the bread, giving thanks to God in the presence of all, they began to eat. And one last thing, this is also a reminder here of Jesus at the Last Supper, the way that he takes the body and the blood, the bread and the wine, and he breaks it in front of the people at the table, and he says publicly, I'm going to die for you. This is my body broken for you. Take and eat it. This is my blood shed for you. He was telling them the good news, but knowing that they weren't going to like it. And that's the same thing Paul is doing. He's breaking the bread saying, God is going to deliver us. It's time to give thanks. And that's what Jesus was saying back in the day. He's saying, God will deliver you through me. Let's break bread and give thanks. And then do this in remembrance of me always. So when you look at what Paul is doing, it's a really big representation of the same thing Jesus and his message was at the Last Supper. I'm breaking my bread, which seems like bad news, but it's actually God delivering you. And Paul is saying with the broken bread, God is delivering us. Let's let him deliver us and trust in him. So this is public faith in times of crisis. You know, they thought Jesus' death was going to be a crisis, turned out to be the best thing in all of human history. They seemed like they were going to go down with the ship and it was going to be awful. But then Paul says, no, we're giving thanks to God because he's saving us. So, always something to remember. Also, looking at the next verse, 36, then they were encouraged and ate some food themselves, which means there were others that joined in with Paul giving thanks. So what kind of impact can your life have on other people? Living faith out loud? It means that other people are given permission to join in. You know, they were all encouraged, and some of them even ate food for themselves. That just shows you that people will believe by your faith. People will believe by seeing that God is faithful and God is true. And the thing is, God knew this was going to happen. God is working through every circumstance. God knows that the northeaster winds are coming that time of year. He knows when Paul's voyage was going to be. He knows that his mission was to go to Rome. Paul is just part of God's plan happening. So all of this, people breaking bread together, people having faith together, people being thankful together, this was all part of God's plan. So when we look at this happening, God is doing amazing things so that other people can witness the power and the faithfulness of God. All right? Does any other version you're reading say any different number than 276? Okay. That's in the parentheses. I know sometimes I have a footnote here, and I want to make sure I give all the information. Some manuscripts say 76 or about 76, but some manuscripts means that most of them say 276. That's why that big number is included in the Bible. But I don't like to leave anything out. If you want to go and read the original manuscripts for yourself, then you can tell me how many say 76 and how many say 276. All right? Okay, the next verse here, it says in verse 38, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So who can tell me what does it mean that they throw out the rest of their food after they've eaten enough? What decision is this for them?
They're not going to stay on the ship and wait around. Like, they feel like this is it. It's happening now. We're going to be saved.
Yes. When they throw the remaining wheat off the boat, they're saying, we're not going to need any more food. We've eaten enough. We've spent 14 days not eating it. And now we're saying we have faith that salvation is coming. We have faith that the end of our voyage is here. So they lighten the ship. They throw the rest of the wheat off after they've had enough. And this is them saying, you know, we're okay. We're going to be fine. We're going to listen and we're going to move forward. So they throw all the rest of the wheat into the sea, a very big decision of faith. And then it says in verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they finally see land. They don't recognize where they are, but the truth is, they made it all the way to Malta. How close is Malta to Italy and where they need to go? It's pretty close. I mean, compared to where they left, they're pretty close. So their 14-day voyage didn't take them anywhere down here, even though the wind was a northeastern wind. It didn't push them too far this direction. It actually moved them across the sea closer to Sicily and Italy and Rome, which is where Paul is trying to go. So even at the end of their storm, they had to find out where they were. They didn't know where they were, but they were closer to their destination than when they started. So God still brought them closer to where they were trying to go. And I think that's an incredible story of faithfulness in itself. Okay, let's continue. So their plan was to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, and at the same time loosened the ropes that tied the rudders. When then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. So it looks like they tied the rudders before when they undergirded the ship in a certain position so that they wouldn't be put off in a lot of other directions. That's one of the defensive moves that they make on a ship. They want the rudder in one direction, so at least they kind of have some stable direction going. And it looks like now they're finally taking those off, and they loosen the rudders again so that they could now take better control of the ship. Then it says, but striking a reef, and then my notes in my Bible say a sandbank or a sandbar, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. Do we have any sailors in here? Anybody that has owned a boat or knows about boats? What part of the boat is the bow and what part of the boat is the stern? Okay, I'm going to take a guess here. I think I know, but so the bow of the ship is the front, and then the stern is the left side. So the bow of the ship was stuck somewhere in the sandbar, but they were still taking damage of the left side, and it says here that because of the waves hitting the ship, that they were losing parts of the ship. So it was coming apart. It says in verse 41 that the bow was stuck and was immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the surf. So we know that they were close enough to shore to have surf breaking up the ship, but they still needed to get there some way. All right, they looked at the bay and they saw their destination. They were close enough to land, but because the ship was being broken up, they couldn't take that anymore. I don't know if at this point they wished they had that other boat back or if they were glad it was gone, but I'm not sure. But it says the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners lest any of them should swim away and escape. So with Paul, it seems like there were more prisoners on this ship along with him, and their big plan was to kill all of them so that they didn't have to deal with them escaping later. And unfortunately, this is kind of how they dealt with their problems back then. If somebody seemed like they were going to escape, they would rather explain a death than explain an escaped prisoner. So their big plan was to eliminate all that could run away and all that could leave. But the centurion, his name is Justice, I think. Hold on. Julius, there we go. Julius is the centurion now over Paul. He's been through a few. And he doesn't want anything bad to happen to Paul. So the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. So I just want to take that. We've got some new people here, and I've said this before. But God is able to use anybody in any place at any time to preserve the plan and the purpose that he has. So throughout Paul's entire journey here, from his trip from Jerusalem all the way to Caesarea, where he was going to be put on trial there, he was kind of in the middle of a plot to kill him. And the Roman government, the governor at that time pulled him out of the Jewish people that were trying to kill him, took him to a safe place. He was imprisoned for 2 years in a palace where he was under guard, where nobody could hurt him at that point. God said, if the Jews are going to try and kill Paul, I'm going to use the Romans to protect Paul. And I think that's a big misinterpretation, that God can only use God-fearing Christians to do his work and his will. I think God is the ultimate power of the universe. If he has a plan and a purpose, it doesn't matter if you believe or not. There's even a scripture in the Bible that says, God there, or it was the disciples getting mad because there were other people trying to cast out demons in God's name. And in one instance, that's a bad thing. But in the one I'm talking about, it says, well, if they're casting out demons, then who's to stop them, is pretty much what they said. So in some cases, God is able to use anyone to do and fulfill the purpose that he wants to do. It's great if we do it because we're working for righteousness' sake, and God sees that as us being faithful. But at the end of the day, God saw how the Jews were turning. God's original chosen people were now not believing in Christ. So he said, I'm going to use the Gentiles. I'm going to use the Romans. They're going to preserve Paul and take him where he needs to go. Because that was Paul's mission in the first place, was to preach God to the Gentiles and to tell them all about Jesus. So that's exactly what God is allowing Paul to do. So we're almost finished here. The centurion kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. And then the rest of them were on planks and on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So even at this point, when they were jumping off the ship and swimming and taking boards and pieces of the ship to shore, the promise of God was true, that still not a single person was lost at sea. And I think at the end of chapter 27, with only one left to go in the whole book of Acts, we see that God is at work here. He's faithful. He's got a plan not only for Paul, but he's using the plan he has for Paul to bring other people closer to God. You see, Paul gives thanks and others join in and eat the food themselves. And he's just using this entire story. I know the main character, it seems, is Paul, but God's providence over the entire thing is not just for Paul to make it somewhere. It's for people to be influenced and impacted along the way. And I wish more people saw their lives in this way. It's not just God getting you to heaven. It's you touching people with God's help along the way. Your life is not just meant to save you and to keep you on track. I mean, that's an important part of it. God cares about you personally. But God doesn't have any small purposes. God doesn't have any small plans. Your life can be used as God's outstretched arms to touch the people around you along the way. So it's just great to see that Paul is being used in that way as well. 276 people on this ship. And I bet all of them were influenced by Paul in some way while he was on the boat. So, just to kind of end here, let's talk about a couple of things. God's providence uses both divine intervention and also human decisions to make sure that anything that needs to happen happens. God's control is not limited by any way. It's not limited by a person. It's not limited by a place or a government power or a king or anything. God's power is over all. So I think we need to see God's overreaching arms, outstretched arms, as covering all things. There's no reason to doubt God. There's no reason to think, oh, this is horrible, but, it's so horrible that God can't touch it. That's just not true. God can see and do anything that he sees necessary to do. There's nothing outside of the power of God. And just because God is just looking upon it and it's happening, it doesn't mean that he can't change it. So I think in this story, there's a shipwreck, there's all sorts of things happening, and somebody might be reading this thinking, why didn't God just stop the wind and calm the storm? Well, I think in this case, we look at Paul and his ministry and his presence on the boat, not needing the power to calm the storm because the storm wasn't going to take them out, but God is using Paul in this instance to calm the people in the storm, to kind of quiet their soul and to put them in a state where they can fully trust in God. You see, sometimes when you take the storm away, people just say, oh, well, I'm fine, okay, I can keep going. But when you remain in the storm and you work through the storm and you make it to the other side, people are saying, okay, God was with me through the storm. God was with me in the worst to the other side. So sometimes when you take the storm away, people don't see the need for God. When you leave the storm there and you teach them how to be calm in the storm and to trust and have faith in the storm, that's where a true relationship is built. So I think in this case, that's what God was doing. There was no need to take the storm away because the storm didn't do any real damage to the people. He wanted to teach them through Paul that you need to have faith in the storm. You don't need to ask for the storm to leave, but you need to ask for you to be strong and faithful through the crisis. These are my last notes, and then we'll go ahead and enter into a time of prayer. It says, Paul doesn't calm the storm, he steadies the people, which is what we just talked about. Acts 27 shows us that mature faith isn't just about survival, but it's about leading others into hope. Paul is a model of spiritual leadership. He's grounded in the promise and the revelation of God. He's grounded in his prayer, and he's grounded in God's presence in his life. He anchors not just his own soul, but he's showing the entire crew and the people on the boat to have unwavering trust in God. So this chapter is a chapter that affirms that God's promises are true to the very end, even in the worst of circumstances, and our faith in the storm must be steady and ready to take on the storm. All right, before we go into prayer, I do like to take time at the end. Does anyone have any questions or things that stuck out to them about this chapter that they want to share with the group?
I find it interesting that Paul didn't seem to realize this was a plan of God because he chastised him. I told you not to do this. So at some point, it may be when the angel appeared to him, that he realized that, hey, God is in this.
Yeah.
That's just...
Which there are a couple options here, and it's hard to understand God, but it could have been him fixing their bad decision, or it could have been him saying, I know you're going to make the bad decision, so this is all going to be part of the plan. It's hard to know exactly how God works, but it could be him using the bad decision all along, or it could be God saying, okay, you made a bad decision, now it's time to turn it for good. And
we do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
We look back and see, oh, that was part of God's plan.
All along. Anything else? I talked for about 40 minutes. I do like to give other people a chance. Okay, good. Well, we are going to pray and take specific prayer requests, but I guess my general prayer request today is that in our lives we can see the crisis and not just abandon ship, but really hold steady and firm and know that God's going to bring us to the other side. So yeah, thank you for joining us today. We are going to end in prayer. I'm going to take prayer requests.